so we can all sit up here. So welcome, and thank you for coming today. And I know everybody's kind of kicked off their studios, so I don't know where this drawer is stuck. But Scott, didn't you design this thing? The drawer's locked? No? I thought you designed this thing. Okay, never mind. All right. Okay, so Gavin's first event, he wants you to notice the little number after. He wants you to notice that number. I promised him I'd tell him that. Okay, so what we're going to do is really an event to welcome 7 new full-time faculty to the School of Architecture at Columbia, and 2 of them aren't here, but they will be soon. Laura's just gone for a minute, for a blip. She'll be back. But, and to use this opportunity to, just for these wonderful people to tell us maybe about what they're working on right now, what's kind of burning, what's important to them, and that in relationship always to the future of the architectural studio. So I thought I would just kind of kick it off by saying I could first, I suppose, make a generalization and say that at Columbia, we're always kind of fiddling with the studios, right? We're always fiddling around with, you know, the format or what we're doing, or we're amending it, or we're modifying it, or we're overhauling it. This is obviously in relation to the future of the architectural studio, or we're recasting it, reviewing it, scrutinizing it. You know, and of course there is no manual. You got to do that? Okay, yeah. Of course there's no manual for defining what the architectural studio is here. And we'll be hearing some thoughts about that here today. But on the other hand, it's also a very old tradition. And it's a tradition that many other disciplines take from, that format of the studio. And it started, as I'm sure you're all aware, in the Beaux-Arts, and where in Paris as the ultimate architectural training. And it's, you know, this philosophy obviously was imported to the United States. Columbia made a dramatic shift, and it gravitated to the other architectural schools in the country, but others that were around at the time. But Columbia made a dramatic shift in 1934 away from this French method and towards those of the Bauhaus movement and towards that model. And the building still looks the same. Inside's a little different. So in the Bauhaus school, and this is no history, it's just a kind of general kind of framing of, you know, why we're maybe all sitting here, or why we're in this building, what are we doing in this building, and what is this format of the studio that we're working within. Gropius, when he designed, and I love this diagram of the, you know, because diagrams are always very telling about their intentions, so the shape of it, you know, the way it's organized. He said that design was neither an intellectual nor a material affair, but simply an integral part of modern concepts of mass production and modern technology, which the Bauhaus had refused to accept. So this kind of process of learning, then, and this is again my very brief history. I wanted to jump to the Eameses for a minute as a kind of model of let's say, a way of teaching architecture. And in their design research through wartime experimentation with plywood and mass production of plywood, and also in the series of documentary films, and this kind of pivotal one, The Communications Primer of the Powers of 10, you know, all of this done before the aid of a computer, sometimes for clients, sometimes for their own purposes. And I wanted then, this is again my abbreviated intro history, I wanted to jump to Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi's Learning from Las Vegas. And in this book, which was really a studio method that Denise Scott Brown drew upon a planning studio format and took it at the University of Pennsylvania and structured the research, you know, in teams and aims and basically started the kind of a research-based studio, I would say. Many would say. I know Cassis has written about this. He's going to show up later with a new haircut, I think, but he'll be here at the end. And if if learning from Las Vegas was a kind of a key moment in architectural research, it did spawn maybe few followers, but some key followers. And these are just some of the images from this, that we all know. But I think through all of this, the architectural studio has always been based in practice. And I think particularly here in the advanced studios, where it's essentially, and I would argue, a practice-based teaching. The studios in those advanced studios, and for the most part, are an extension of one's practice. So perhaps the question is also, I'd like to extend it to be, what is the practice of an architect? Because that's also it's a very open question today, and it's in how one practices. And so I'm very interested in the 5 that are here today to hear from them about the question of the future of the studio, and then perhaps in brackets the question of the future of practice. And so we're going to follow the alphabetical order, so original. So Amale is going to go first. Is that okay? And then I'm just going to read a brief text for Laura and just kind of say some highlights about Juan. And then everybody's going to basically speak from here, and we'd like to, have some discussion among ourselves with you, and these presentations will be short so that hopefully we can do that. So.
Of how far we've gone in exploring this question already, but I will try to add a little today. And
we're trying the new remote.
Oh, okay. We're trying to. Okay, so it's okay.
Somebody, there you go. It's up. Okay.
It's up. Well, so. And as it was dark and we were finally leaving the wood bunker, I thought we probably looked like this still from the Bruce High Quality Foundation's piece called The Isle of the Dead, or John McMurrough's Zombies, which he describes in his essay Ruminations, the Haunts of Contemporary Architecture, restless, eternally optimistic, and still going through the motions of architecture even after it was declared missing. The architecture studio has certainly been leading the search, constantly expanding its territory and tools of exploration. And Wednesday, there were certainly many striking and charged presentations where one could discern great potential and a number of emerging concerns. So as someone who teaches, although teaches is really in quotation mark, studio, I would propose 3 immediate concerns I have for the future of the studio. The first is the notion of archive. Can studio more actively learn from recent past studios, start where one ended? Can we start to establish successes and failures, or identify best practices and strategies in engaging in this or that topic? If the lab is a studio that graduated, can the studio learn more from the lab while remaining shorter and more open-ended? Clearly, this is all already happening, of course, in a viral way, but I'm wondering whether we can curate it or be more strategic about this. The second question I have is the rules of engagement. It seems as though these kinds of explorations have been going on for a while, and while the studio has certainly evolved dramatically, much of its structure remains the same. First, there's nothing, then there's research, then there's the project. But this relationship between research and project, between idea and architecture, is still very tenuous. How do we do research? What do we bring inside? What do we export to the outside? All these seem to want to be kind of examined and probed further again and more radically. And the third question is the question still of audience. There was much excitement about the expanded audience a decade ago, but it seems to me that the jury is still out on exactly what that has meant for us and for practice. not only who is this public we are designing for, but how do we access it and make architecture actually relevant again, which is, I think, very much along the lines of what the exhibition we are opening tonight is about. And so in the spirit of this exhibition, of looking back to move forward, I'd like to offer two images with very different vibes. The first is my favorite East Village mural of Joe Strummer's quote. I thought with the eternal nostalgia and music, some of you might actually know The Clash. But Joe Strummer was the lead singer of The Clash. And there was a documentary called The Future is Unwritten. Obviously, we can't know the future, but the future is possible. We can shape it. And so how we decide to shape it is an important question that I think we can ask in studio. The second is my favorite architectural moment. I would love to Photoshop myself in there. At least there will be a woman, but and it's the Workshop for Peace, another amazing documentary, if you haven't seen it, which is describes how a group of architects, great architects, but also just architects nevertheless, were propelled center stage to redesign literally a new world order through the design of a complex of buildings. Power, public architecture, negotiations, compromises, concerns, peace, the world as audience, and major arguments between Korb and Niemeyer about whether the base should be attached to the tower or separated from it. So a visionary idea and a visionary form, both very real and still highly effective and relevant. While we may think that we can never get back to this moment, it seems we were just there a decade ago, and as we all know, and many have noted and written about, we sort of missed it. Maybe we weren't ready, so we can certainly continue to aspire to such a moment, or at least be inspired by it. So this is a break. And in our practice, we have found that our zombie state combined with a certain nostalgia for utopia has been quite productive. In 2009, we published a 2-year research into visionary cities, rereading them through an ecological lens, examining the intertwined relationship between the urban, the rural, and the natural, as well as looking at architecture as urbanism or infrastructure as architecture, etc. And all of these investigations led to a number of projects, such as Public Farm 1. Here, the kind of open source book that describes the process that my partner Dan is trying to sell at the Green Market, called Above the Pavement, the Farm. And a number we're currently working with Alice Waters to design 5 edible schoolyards, working also with the School Construction Authority, so within public schools. Looking at architecture and infrastructure, architecture as infrastructure. And this is a recent competition we just submitted with Guy Nordenson. And looking at cities, obviously, and infrastructure and public space. Currently completing the foreclosed project, Foreclosed Rehousing the American Dream, which is kind of co-hosted by Buell and MoMA. We've also have a new, more recent strand of research into cultural and art institutions, working much more around the notion of just strategy and usually finding ways to operate within impossibly tight budgets. This is the Children's Museum of Art's opening up soon, museum in Houston. And this is the project that I'll show in more detail, the competition we recently won for a new master plan for New Holland Island in St. Petersburg. The island disappeared, but it was actually designed by Peter the Great and completely inaccessible to the public until today. Incredible monumental architecture already on the site, with very redundant structure, which make transforming it very difficult. How do you create new use within kind of such a sort of rhythm that is very tight? Our intention for the project was really to try and maximize the use of the existing structures and not necessarily add a new statement, but rather work through subtraction to create a series of voids that would then allow for kind of new life to happen within them. And this liberates the site for kind of public park. And the one sort of architectural or strategic intervention for a new building is a wedge infrastructure piece, which combines parking infrastructure as well as exhibition spaces, sustainable systems for all of the warehouses, the cogen plant, etc. But also allows you to kind of see the entire island, either from the level of the wedge or if you go up using a balloon. And the second intervention is a kind of more flexible one, using two of the walls of the existing structure to stretch a kind of tent. We're not sure yet what it will be, which provides what is missing on the site, which is a kind of semi-enclosed space for larger exhibition, and is at the scale of the garage in Moscow, which is our client's other kind of cultural center. And so from that big space, you would access the smaller galleries. And in the winter, the entire park moves inside, and all of the voids are connected through a kind of elevated promenade. And so this is by no means a design, but it's a kind of strategy that we are, that kind of is a pre-project. That's it.
Okay. Thank you. I'm also David Benjamin, and I didn't mention work AC, but you're next, right, David? Yeah. With your, yeah. You need a microphone, though, right?
Before I launch this video, I'll just give a quick overview or like background to what my thinking is. I guess much of my vision of the future of the architecture studio and also my own research and practice, just like Amale discussed that balance. So much of mine revolves around technology and its instantiation in people, places, and things. But I want to note that that's not to say that I worship technology. In fact, each kind of investigation or experiment kind of critiques and responds to technology as much as it idealizes and prototypes with technology. So what I want to do is present a kind of a series of ideas and example projects that illustrate the ideas. Oops. Sorry, I didn't realize I was playing. AV request. Yeah. So sorry, we need to back up because the deal was it. No, the deal was it wasn't going to play till I hit go. Yeah, this was happening before. Can you go to the beginning and just pause it until like a couple of seconds from now? Sorry, because it's video, so I have to time it kind of. So anyway, I want to present less of a kind of singular vision for what I think the future of the architecture studio should be, and more of what I consider kind of an open-ended list of features that I think the future of the architecture studio should include. And you'll see them noted by these numbers here. So, okay, now we can press play. So one, designing adaptive systems. In other words, the future of the architecture studio might include each of these features. So in this project called Living City, we created what we think of as a platform for buildings to talk to one another. So in this idea and use of technology, each building shares its sensor data with other buildings, existing sensor data or new sensor data, and buildings create their own organic social networks, kind of like Facebook for buildings. This project involves kind of reimagining the building envelope to be a location for sensing information about the environment, for filtering and processing data from both local and remote locations, and for doing local effects, including like opening up its skin, literally breathing in response to data. And more specifically for this project, in order to prototype it, in order to experiment with technology, we installed sensor networks on different buildings. For example, the Empire State Building in New York, a gallery in San Francisco, and they communicated with one another, shared their data in real time. 2, designing public interaction and public space. In a series of projects along these lines, we explored different issues of the city, including this one in Seoul, Korea, where we redrew the map of the city based on existing air quality sensors. We bent that into a kind of map in a dome shape. Then we used a series of digital technologies or computational technologies to evolve a series of branching columns to support this fixed dome shape. So here are different permutations, and we're using the power of computation to help us explore 25,000 or more possible designs and look for the most fit ones according to the least use of material and the best structural shape, and we discover some unexpected possibilities that perform better than the rule of thumb. And finally, when we construct this pavilion, it allows us to engage the city and public interaction and public space by glowing and blinking in response to both real-time air quality data and in response to what we consider public interest in the environment. So we kind of think of this project as a potential building envelope of the future. You can imagine this envelope being adapted to existing buildings or new buildings. It engages the public, it registers information about our shared resources and our collective concerns, and it makes visible conditions of our environment that are normally invisible. In a related project that we were working on at the same time, this one in collaboration with an artist, Natalie Jeremijenko, we imagined a similar use of technology to explore the public space of the river surfaces, and more specifically a kind of horizontal building envelope in the city that exists on rivers. This project involved a floating network of sensors and lights, sensors below water, lights above water, and it included the potential to text message the interface and receive back real-time information, and also cause it to register the request and therefore make visible to other people that someone was interested in the environment. So the more blinking of the system, the more interest in the environment. And we also had a few other layers of information, including the color of the lights responding to water quality in a comparative way. Blue lights means the water quality is better now than last week, and red means the reverse. And so this project kind of allowed us to explore something a little bit techy and using technology, but really it was a project about public awareness, and we had a couple of ideas, including that instead of treating the surface of the water as a reflective surface to kind of mirror ourselves and our cities, it could be considered a site of experimentation. So at the same time we were exploring this kind of public interaction, we were also exploring personal interaction. In this kind of quick project, we explored 2 features of our site in southern China, which are street food and low-cost electronics. We created a kind of custom soup bowl that allows people to program in short text message-based messages and hide them beneath food that others will discover. So it's a kind of an interface to exchange. It engages surprise, a sense of wonderment, and you can get a sense of the experience here. But again, it's using technology not just for cold-blooded efficiency. Okay, designing ecosystems, number 4. In this project, we started with this fascinating kind of material technology called viscous threading. And you've probably seen that, like you drip honey from a spoon and it creates this coiling effect. Well, if you drip a viscous liquid like silicone onto a conveyor belt or a rotating plate, it creates different patterns, a straight line if the movement of the plate is pretty fast, and then other patterns if it's slower. And we use this as one element in the design of an ecosystem where we combined forces of kind of synthetic construction, this plastic, forces of natural construction, in this case liquid moss, and what we consider kind of a third material, which is the material of ideas. And more specifically, we set up a real-time index of web searches for terms about the future to monitor a kind of index of our thinking about the future, and that influenced in real time the construction of a kind of environment. So we're imagining digital technology not for absolute control and zero tolerance, but rather for its real-time ability. And we set up the system, ran it for 30 days without touching it. You see that it establishes a certain kind of equilibrium, maybe like other ecosystems. Then it reaches a kind of tipping point because of some like extreme weather in the web searches, and then discovers a new equilibrium. Now, a kind of work in progress that I have been doing involves design with biology. I'm working with a plant biologist, and here you see how we're taking microscope photos of the exoskeleton of plant cells, xylem cells, and one of the first things you can do with them is create digital models, scale them up, make 3D prints, so you can kind of start to mimic the form of nature. But what we think is much more interesting is mimicking the logic of nature, or using the logic of nature as a design tool. So here you can design different bounding envelopes for these tiny cells, and then watch the way that the cell distributes its material efficiently, and you can change the bounding envelope and watch the change in the exoskeleton of the cell. So we think that's the start of how you could use the cell as a design tool. In this version of the same project, we create a mathematical model of what the cell is doing through an incredible program of a computer scientist named Hod Lipson. And that allows us, once you have a mathematical model of how something in nature works, then you can change the inputs and change the outputs, so you can see how the cell how its logic would apply to something else, or like a design problem like architecture. Now, a second but related project, and this is related to the studio that I'm teaching this semester, involves bacterial patterning. So these are photos at a scale the human eye could see of bacterial patterning. And recently it's become possible to make mathematical models, and therefore computer programs that encapsulate this understanding of bacterial patterning, which basically allows you to create parametric models of how complex forces in nature are working. You can change the inputs and see the changes in outputs, change the input of the system of bacteria and see the changes in outputs. And how that connects to kind of material technologies involves two existing processes, one in which you can use bacteria to create thin, flexible sheets, like shown on the left, and another in which you can use bacteria to create solid, rigid, brick-like material, like shown on the right. And you can combine those. Using that and the power of computing, imagine that what's shown up there is a pattern produced of these red and green areas. And you can use computation to explore the behavior that comes from nature through the computer, and then instantiate it back in physical built form. Finally, and this one will be quick, we think that in current technologies we might explore also designing narratives. Have an unquenchable thirst for lightweight lithium-ion batteries, and in this world, lithium, otherwise known as gray gold, is the most valuable natural resource. Lithium is found in the salt flats of the world, and prospectors kind of roam the landscape searching for these invisible deposits of lithium. And furthermore, they use what turns out to be the best technology for finding these deposits, which is 19th century analog technology of paper chromatography, to identify disruptions in a gradient pattern and therefore know the location where the lithium was found. And so basically this is to say that all research about technology involves stories about technology, and we're as interested in exploring those stories and those potentials as the kind of technical implementation of the technology itself. Thanks.
Okay, so Lise and Couture and Asymptote.
So how do I advance the slides?
Well, there's a little wand point somewhere there.
How does it work?
They know how to use it.
Oh, forward. Forward. This is forward.
No, this is for
And then I have to.
I don't think you put it in
I think
this is?
No.
No, I think you
Okay.
it will work.
All right.
It'll work.
So I feel very fortunate to have been appointed as professor in practice. And as such, I'm going to be concentrating my talk on the aspects of our work that most represent a kind of more conventional notion of practice and I think relate in some way. I've selected projects that I hope will relate to the theme of my studio this semester so that if there are any questions, it'll be easier to make a kind of correlation. I was really surprised when I saw the poster 2 days ago because when I received the email invitation to speak at this panel, I immediately thought of W5. And when I was growing up in Canada, I had very limited access to television. And there was one show called W5 that was an adult show that I was allowed to watch, which was essentially who, what, where, and when. But it did make me think also about which of those 5 W's is relevant here. And I think that as a practitioner, what it really comes down to is the what. Because for every what that we do, there could be many whys, there could be many hows, there could be many wheres. For every why, there can be many whats, but in the end, it's the one that you carry through that matters. And given the kind of somewhat permanence relative of our endeavor, you know, we can't rely on whys and hows for our work to have meaning and value beyond our demise or the kinds of transformations that take place in our society. So given that kind of notion of what I'm kind of putting forward, just to show you some of the what we have done in the past few years at Asymptote, where I'm a partner with Hani Rashid. So the most recent project that we've constructed is this Yaz Hotel. It's a 500-room hotel in Abu Dhabi. And as much as it might seem a kind of very large departure from the early projects that we've done, which had to do with kind of art installations, early explorations with technology, in our mind, it's a continuity. It deals with many of the themes that we've always been interested in, capturing notions of atmosphere and materiality, dealing with technology in ever multiple ways. Has to do with the media, the fact that this building was designed to be experienced in the flesh, so to speak, but every year at the F1 race, which is the largest televised event besides the final World Cup, is viewed by millions or billions of people, and it's also experienced on the internet. So it has this kind of larger presence. And so how do you begin to kind of address architecture at that scale? And it also becomes the kind of, now it's the icon for the city. And if you look in the New Yorker, and the city of Abu Dhabi has several advertisements every month, and more often than not, they'll feature some image of our building, either a kind of icon or the larger project. So it's, and it has many levels of complexity. It's on a marina, it's on an F1 track, and these kinds of things are very interesting to us. But one of the biggest challenges for us was in terms of technology and working with parametrics that assisted us in dealing with logistics. How do you go from design to full construction in 23 months? Concept to completed construction in 23 months. So a lot of issues that are more ephemeral, the notion of atmosphere that these panels create in terms of a kind of fourth dimension to the architecture, kind of also deal with very real issues of construction, assembly, logistics, also environmental. It provides a way of kind of creating a chimney effect in the building. And of course, the kind of issues of interior that follow some of the same ideas. Now this, in my mind, again, is not so far off from one of our first I think it's actually our first project that has a basement. Not the first build project. The first build project also had to do with technology, but it was a tensile project. And this one was the HydroPier project, and it was a very early parametric project, actually, and with very rudimentary tools, essentially working with spreadsheets and toggling a design, we would increase or decrease the complexity of the geometry so that the number of curved panels could meet our budget. At the same time, there were notions about atmosphere, about virtuality that had to do with water running on a surface, being underwater, being on the water, seeing the sky through water, seeing airplanes through water, and so on. That had, again, to do with our interest in some of the installation-based work and surrealism. Oh, that's not supposed to be there, but that's a project for Korea. Now, the scale of our work has also fluctuated, and I think some of those concerns have continued to evolve in different ways, and we've also embarked upon other interests. This is a tower for Abu Dhabi that was never completed, and again, a kind of notion of the ephemeral was dealt with here in terms of the skin of the building, and it's kind of difficult to see in the slide, but there was a strategy for louvers that would begin to create a more dynamic facade. But relative to the studio that I'm teaching today, I think that this project also points towards a couple of directions that we feel we're being pulled in currently. And I think it situates, it's kind of one project that kind of sits within a generation of projects that have been proposed or built over the last 10 years that are very much a product of the technology, not just of construction, but the technology of designing. And the fact that we have certain programs at our disposal allows us to innovate with certain kinds of geometry for the first time, to also work perhaps very closely with engineers through the exchange of digital information such that we can achieve things that had previously been perceived as having too much complexity. So on the one hand, we're doing that, and that comes out with a certain kind of language that I think is not all that unfamiliar and has become increasingly familiar, I think, since this was first proposed. This was first sketch design was 2006, so it's already 5 years old. And at the time that we did it, there was no other twisted towers. So, but along with that language, there was another language that we were very interested in, and that has to do with this is the base of the building, which again, I think for those of you who participated in the lottery presentations, this idea of a kind of more solid language, a more solid tectonic. And so it seems that we find ourselves very much aware of the trajectories that architecture is taking as a result of technology, both in the design field process and also in the process of construction. And we're very curious in terms of how this is going to play out over time. Just to give you a bit of background, that was a large-scale project, but in small-scale projects also, we're constantly finding ourselves being pulled towards a language that has to do with this kind of virtual, seamless expression, and at the same time wanting to make things that are very robust, strong, and solid. Other examples of this kind of duality and dichotomy have to do with this kind of virtual exhibition space we did for VW. It's very much coming from the line of our installations. The ceiling plane and the floor plane are essentially reflections of each other across a datum in the center of the space, and it's intended to contain only digital information, so all of the information is virtual. So you're kind of existing in a virtualized world, and this is actually constructed. So this kind of notion of ephemeral and the kind of solidity of the real very much confronted in this installation, and other projects where we use technology also kind of end up reverting to a language that sometimes is much more about a kind of sculpted as opposed to the seamless and the lightness. So the two stores, the Alessi store and again the Miele store, which again uses the digital technology here to make digital patterns, and this was really built very much like a ship. Even the Perry Street, which I think falls again into this trajectory that we've seen very much over the past 10 years of the kind of skin building that I refer to in my studio brief, at the same time oscillates between a kind of carved solid object. And the notion of transparency for us also here is one of ambiguity, going back and forth between being transparent and opaque at the same time, and engaging the body in a dynamic condition relative to that. And the notion of kind of being able to carve into solids and into surfaces here is almost simulated with the use of light and materials, and a desire to take the two-dimensional and make it three-dimensional. This is a project that we're hopefully moving forward with in Bergamo, Italy. I think you can see that this also is kind of very much in line of using the technology to derive geometry, and it's very much about this kind of skinning. So it's about that kind of tautness and that lightness that I think is very much part of the lineage of the first decade of this century. Now, in contrast to that, or I think probably following that also, is this competition that we did for Kaohsiung, Port Terminal. And I'm kind of showing these from a very kind of formal level, but obviously there are many other ideas here that have to do with, urbanism. This port terminal was deliberately lifted above the ground plane. It becomes a way to engage the city, to bring the city to the edge, to create a new public space, and so on and so forth. But from the idea of language and expression and technology, again, you sort of see this geometry, this use of parametrics as a way to begin to modulate light, to bring another texture or a level of texture to the architecture. And kind of perhaps more closely related, you can see again the kind of manipulation parametrically having to do with ceiling tiles that are translucent and allow control of light. But having to do with my studio this semester, this is one of the most recent projects, and it's for a crematorium. I know it sounds very morbid, but it's actually also a cultural building in the outskirts of Rotterdam. Ironically, the man who commissioned it is 98 years old, and he would like to see it finished before it's too late. But this project ended up being a bit of a dilemma for us, because we really wanted to make something very solid, and at the same time the kind of budget and technology that was available to us really kind of suggested a skinning kind of strategy. Nevertheless, we really wanted to explore the language of a different kind of language, one that really harkened back to some of the precedents that I mentioned in my studio submission or studio presentation on Wednesday, having to do with creating space by carving and by sculpting, as opposed to this idea of kind of skinning. So some of these interiors are intended to, kind of slow. So you can see again this idea of somehow having an articulated interior volume that's derived from, but maybe different from, the exterior. The creation of poché space is very interesting to us in this project, and I feel like a lot of our work has not been this so much in this direction, and I also think that one could say part of it has to do, to a certain extent, with the trajectory of who is commissioning the work and under what criteria. And the notion of poché itself is really interesting, because so often when you do a project, one of the key things a client will ask you is, what's the net to gross? And the minute you kind of have a big shaded dark spot that says, like, nothing happens in here, it's very problematic. So, I'm kind of simplifying something that's very complex, and I'm probably oversimplifying our own work just to kind of show one line that's related to what I'm doing in studio. But I do think that there is a trajectory that we're on collectively as practitioners right now, that I'm part of that generation. And I think that when you're in school, the question is not to necessarily get on that bandwagon, so to speak, but to begin to question it. So on the one hand, I feel like we're very adept at doing a lot of beautiful things, but they're not so unfamiliar anymore. And that makes me nervous. I like to always be pushing the envelope as an architect, or our firm does. So we look at, other ideas of how you make space and how you make objects. And I think Stephen Hall referred to this kind of technique at his presentation of shrink wrapping. It's kind of also something that we experimented with on a recent project that I didn't show you. So in studio, I think, as architects, as a practitioner, I'm always concerned with the who and the when and the where and the how, but in the end, it comes down to what. And then, but I think in studio, it's really what we ask is what if? And then after we ask what if, we ask what then?
Okay, so there are two people that aren't here, and there's no way I can summarize their work, but I just want to note them. So Juan Herreros, who is an amazing architect in Spain and who will become part of our full-time faculty, also is on the faculty of the High Technical School of Architecture at Madrid, and I'm sure you are familiar with his work, and if you're not, you should be. And I just would mention, I'm not showing any images. Are those his images? Oh, he's showing, oh no, sorry. Okay, this is going to be Laura. Somebody who's trained both first as a structural engineer and then as an architect, and who designed things, and I always think of Juan as very much as a kind of public architect. I'm just going to put a few words out on the table here to kind of throw them out, and that he designed things from a prefabricated house to the recycling center in Madrid, which I think is an incredible project and is a real model project for lots of reasons. And then Laura Kurgan, who is not here, but just to kind of, because I think it's a really interesting cross line, kind of cut section through practice here. She's not here because she's in Barcelona giving the keynote lecture for Design, History, and Society Annual Conference of 2011 in Barcelona, Design, Activism, and Social Change. And she says it's a super interdisciplinary art history, art, and architecture event, which is very much like this place. And I'm just going to read something very briefly, and we're showing a video from her Terra Natale piece, which is at MoMA right now and was originally installed at the Cartier Foundation in Paris. So this is her text. So now I don't have the accent. I apologize, the South African accent. But she says, we constantly read navigational maps in print, on computers and mobile phones, in PowerPoint presentations and blogs. Maps are used to visualize everything from the movement of hurricanes and refugees to patterns of traffic and political affiliation. Maps and the sophisticated technologies that create them are not limited, of course, to the public domain. We can only imagine the complex maps housed in the nose cone of a cruise missile, or those that detail the location of every phone call and email intercepted by the Department of Homeland Security. As maps become the increasingly common means of navigating everyday and complex situations alike, the more we tend to take them for granted. We see them as representations and descriptions of space rather than the interpretations of information that they are, and hence the more critical our task of analyzing them becomes. My work, her work, the project of orientation, visibility, location, use, action, and exploration into question without dispensing with maps. Is that a sentence? They are built with GPS, remote sensing satellites, or geographic information systems, digital spatial hardware and software that was designed for military and governmental use, such as reconnaissance, secrecy, monitoring, ballistics, the census, and national security. Rather than shying away from the politics and complexities of their intended use, these maps attempt to understand them. I don't know if he's going to play it. Are you going to show? He's showing it. Okay, good. So this is Terra Natale. And so she says, where some of my projects manipulate data to affect policy, Terra Natale manipulates data to tell a story. In this collaborative project, 6 different data sets create a narrative of people, global migration, and time, world population, remittances, refugees, so-called natural disasters, rising seas and sinking cities, and endangered languages in relation to tropical deforestation. Each data set is about people, and the data determine what was on the screen at any given time. So if we didn't draw part of Canada, for example, then that's because the data told us not to. In fact, there was never Canada. In fact, there was never a complete set of images, a complete image of the Earth. So in fact, there was never a complete image of the Earth. So as you're watching this contrasted with the unifying image of the project, the blue marble, a composite of cloudless Landsat images of the globe. These images were stitched together and released to the public by NASA in 2005. In Terra Natale, the blue marble rotates around viewers, printing both data and maps to highlight the interrelationship between the two and to tell a very simple message. The people who are least responsible for the forces causing global migration are the ones most affected by it. They are the ones who are forced to move. And Laura also is the director of the Spatial Information Design Lab here at Columbia. So did we see it all? Good. So Hilary Sample, Moss.
Thank you, Laurie. It's great to be here starting teaching in the housing studio. Had an interesting conversation with my students already, and one of the questions was, will we be starting with Grasshopper? So
Will we be what?
Starting with Grasshopper in the studio as a method for working. And so I think if that's a kind of indication of a question of the future studio, is an interesting one about methods and means and representation. But not knowing what future you meant when you asked me to be in this panel, I took this to mean the near future. And it seems to me that this future is going to be about representation. And so that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about right now. The problems of pedagogy aren't really new, but what is always new is the context that pedagogy is what is shifting. The world is shifting, and therefore the schools shift in turn. Recently, media is really one of the major shifts, and how to construct an audience for ourselves is one of the most important challenges for the discipline in the near future. The discipline of architecture is always a myth, and a myth that we have to continuously construct and reconstruct. For instance, we as architects are being affected by the things at the moment. The economy leading to a slowdown in building, a potential double dip. We are also suffering from an exhaustion of overbuilding from the last decade. So how do we talk about architecture? Representation in the past was inward-looking, the 80s, even the 90s, was about more of a kind of internal dialogue. But today we need to produce a new audience for architecture. To know the future means you must know the present, which is, in a way, a kind of smorgasbord, or potentially even a ruin, where everything seems equal in value. And so therefore it seems important to reestablish a value system that can be argued for. Perhaps maybe we need some more battles. Not that I really like the term battle, it's too macho for me, but that these could be played out even in a kind of theatrical sense for the benefit of the students. And we all usually go have drinks after we have these fake battles, but the faculty, that is. So to guess on the future is something I can only do because I exist in the world in a double life, both as a teacher and in practice in the world at large. The last decade seemingly represents a lot of building, perhaps over, in a way, a kind of thinking, a kind of, let's say, something that when I was a student was much more about ideas of thinking because there wasn't much building going on. And it's not to say that building doesn't require thinking, but it feels like there's been a kind of extravagant, expressionistic, formal pursuit that the near future now is in a position to question and ask what those values or that value system means for architecture. It certainly, in a way, seems as though we talk about architecture as what's cool or not cool. It has been, after all, incredibly exciting. But is there another way to potentially frame this discussion? Previous avant-garde practices have become corporate practices. Think of the kind of pattern field. The effects of trying to change architecture has now maybe become too filled with corporate logos. And the reaction against this comes in the form of a kind of activist architecture, but perhaps this only reiterates the problem of making and doing, but without a kind of established criticism or critics in a kind of value discussion. Although a value system is not objective but subjective, to talk about the aesthetic project of architecture, not only about function, but architecture is not only better because it performs better, but because architecture creates a new audience based on values. We need to project more possibilities in the world and establish these values. I think one of the things in my office, which is a really small office, we do projects in the US and abroad because of all these new opportunities with media and technologies. We're able to be incredibly flexible. But we're interested in creating an audience and kind of carving out our own space in between things. I think I'm in the generation where we were sort of offered up two models, the Eisenman model or the Koolhaas model. And for us, I think we try to find something that is maybe in between those two things, maybe at moments rejecting neither or accepting both. It's a debate. I think we're also happy to think of ourselves in a way more like a kind of weirdo band, that we are more interested in being small rather than large, but always pushing ideas and the boundaries of what the discipline is and trying to redefine those definitions, figure out what it is, and potentially at moments have to destroy what we sort of understood it to be to rebuild. And one way of doing that for us has been through technology, through film, and through representation. We're not, and I'm not, interested in the kind of split between art and life, but rather to look at these things together. So, what I just want to show briefly, I wanted to keep it short, are just some stills from 3 projects, 3 sort of time-based media films, let's say, that we've made over the past few years. We did a series of temporary projects. This is PS1 from 2009 called Instant Untitled. We built this kind of large-scale installation, knowing it would come down, and one of the things we wanted to do was for ourselves create another kind of history about it. And so we did a kind of project within it and filmed it and wrote a story about it in its kind of past life. This is a project that's a house that's actually being constructed in New Mexico, and was one of the first schemes we made. The story we wrote to go with the model and the project actually have nothing to do with each other. But we took it as an opportunity to, again, this idea of creating our own space and trying something out, a story that is about 2 characters, Frank and Alice, and their exchange, both being architects in a practice called boudoir. The title of the film is called The Romance of Systems. And the last one is from Venice Biennale called Not Negative. And we looked at the idea of a kind of future and also the use of technology and this kind of way in which we talk to each other, also a kind of questioning of audience within the idea of the theme of the Biennale, which was people, meat, and architecture. And that's it. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try and present what I've taught at Columbia since I started in about 5 minutes. So the title of the talk would have been How I Taught Certain of My Studios. It's an homage to Raymond Roussel. I didn't have the courage to, or the pretentiousness to write it down, but I had enough of the pretentiousness to at least say it. So I'll give a brief presentation on what I've taught, and then I'll read you a project in the space of practice towards the end. So since I started teaching, I've actually taught 3 studios. And that's in a period of about 10 years. Each studio, by and large, became a project, and the way in which it became a project is, by and large, through the following steps. I teach a studio through a number of installments, and these installments take a number of years. The years vary according to the topic. Then, after those installments, I usually take the problem to the seminar format. So the same problem is tackled through a different format. As the problem is basically being clarified through teaching, I start lecturing on the topic, and subsequently I start writing on the topic, as a result of which I would expect, because none of the cycles is actually fully finished, I will then basically publish a small booklet on each one of the 3 studios. The first 2 cycles basically ended up taking about 10 years, as a result of which I decided that before starting the 3rd one, I would declare outright that it would last 10 years, so that I would not suffer from the 10 years as a fate, but I would exploit it as a potential. Needless to say, as soon as I declared that I would do it for 10 years, I was losing interest after 2. So the first project is called Under Constraint. It was a series of 3 studios that I taught at Columbia when I arrived in 2003. And the assumption is the following. Actually, I must also add that basically each one of the 3 studios has an assumption that implies a series of questions, and the assumption has to do with the problem of making in architecture. So even though basically I'm supposedly coming from the theory space, the problem is always basically a so-called theory of design. It has to do basically with a number of ideas about the making of architecture. And these assumptions are basically tested through the studios. And in turn, I must also say that each one of these assumptions were coming from a different field, each of the 3 coming actually from literature, and as a result of which each one of the studios has a kind of patron saint of literature coming from French literature, all 3. So the first one is basically called Under Constraint. The assumption was that a constraint, as opposed to being an enemy, is an ally, or that it's an ally precisely because it's an enemy. In other words, it's an obstacle that allows for you to basically potentially open up ideas about production. The series Under Constraint basically started with, as I said, a number of writers and a list of precedents upon which I constructed an argument. And the assumption for architecture was that if architecture is a practice which by definition implies constraints, how would basically a model coming from literature would basically become potential in the space of architecture? So the first assumption is, as I said, a constraint is a potential space of exploration. Secondly, if a constraint is a space of exploration, it's an ally rather than an enemy, then the most elevated or the ideal scenario of a constraint is the constraint which is self-imposed. In other words, a constraint which is not needed by the object you produced. It's a constraint which is not given by the brief, but a constraint that you as producer, author, writer, architect, whatever field you'd like to engage, are basically imposing on yourself voluntarily, simply to open up possibilities of, in your case, design. So as you see, basically this is a kind of a pantheon of people writing or making films under constraint. The first 200 words are writers, the second half, also 200, are filmmakers. Most of the writers come from the group Oulipo, and I would say Raymond Roussel, who you see at the very beginning, is the first kind of inspiration of the project. So the assumption is A, a constraint is an ally, B, a constraint should be self-imposed, as a result of which there's actually 2 more implications. If a constraint is self-imposed, therefore voluntary, it's also arbitrary. Therefore, it has to be completely split from any form of content in the work that you're producing. As a matter of fact, one of the ways in which Oulipo, the group of writers and mathematicians who worked under constraint, defined a constraint was not unlike a scaffolding. In other words, a structure that allowed for you to construct a building, but after which you would remove and would leave no trace on the building. As a result of which, indeed, a constraint should leave no mark whatsoever on the project you produce. So the first attempt was to dissociate a constraint from any form of content, message, secret, or underlying logic of a building. It was simply a tool that was self-imposed to open up possibilities, after which it was discarded, and the other metaphor I used was actually Hitchcock's MacGuffin, as a way, basically, a tool that you used in order to basically produce a certain result, after which you simply discarded the tool. The second implication of the self-imposed constraint was that it was imposed at the very beginning, yet it didn't imply an origin, because it didn't need to be there. It was arbitrary. As a result of which, a constraint operated precisely in the opposite manner that a design method. It was not basically the step-by-step series of operations that would lead you from origin to result, but quite the contrary, a number of obstacles that by and large would have as an outcome failure. The studios indeed had problematized two questions of architecture at the time. Notions of design, which were the diagram and the concept. The aspiration was basically that a constraint would counter the concept precisely in giving a tool that would not imply meaning and would basically counter the diagram in that it would basically allow for a number of obstacles to design without prescribing steps in the making. So there was indeed a discussion with a kind of house of cards of Eisenman, sequential step-by-step design method that have actually prevailed under different disguises in academic setting. So the studios basically fetishized obsession and failure, and at this stage, basically, they are at the level of a writing. I'm actually writing the texts. So the second one, which is actually the first, but I didn't teach these studios at Columbia, is called The Ordinary. I taught it at Columbia as a seminar already. And the assumption of these studios was basically the old surrealist assumption that the potential can be found in the actual, that basically the existing conditions can contain the seeds for the new, and operated upon basically the technique of wandering and collecting stuff until one would transform itself into a finding. They very, very soon became a seminar and basically remained a logic of seminar, as a result of which I will not expand on these, because there was a prevalent architectural tradition already in place, which was the one that Laurie basically mentioned, that goes from learning from Las Vegas to Deleuze, New York, to Bow Wow. In other words, the logic of the ordinary, where all that architecture that the field of architecture excludes from the field of architecture, at what point basically architects decided to embrace that stuff into the field and use it as a transformative series of elements. So in the end, these studios became quickly a series of seminars on the retroactive manifesto, or the learning from, which I, interesting enough, expand on in our event on manifestos towards the end of the semester. As I said, basically the kind of literary backing of these studios in the beginning, before it was basically the Venturi's trip to the existing conditions, was Comte de Lautréamont, the chance encounter of the umbrella and the sewing machine on the dissecting table. Basically the fact that two banal objects by the sheer chance encounter on the dissecting table could become indeed ecstatic. That indeed the actual was contained, the potential was contained in the actual. The third one is the one that I'm currently teaching. I'm actually midway. It's called The Dictionary of Received Ideas, and the backing is Gustave Flaubert, Le Dictionnaire des idées reçues. It's a project that basically I started 5 years ago, and it's based just as Flaubert's project. It has the ambition of basically collecting all the received ideas or clichés that are produced in the field of architecture over the past 10 years. In other words, ideas that at some point had extraordinary vigor, but out of recurrent use and abuse have basically lost and been depleted of their intensity, yet are still wandering around within the scene and are actually used. Or in a slightly more radical definition, solutions to problems that had that have outlived the problem. In other words, problems that no longer exist, but the solutions are still wandering around, being used by people. So the project of the studio is, like Flaubert, to produce an extraordinary inventory of cliches, to the point that a designer would feel, would basically fear of designing for the fear indeed of using one of the cliches contained in our dictionary. But it also basically exploits one of the lessons from the series The Ordinary, which is that a cliché, once defined, once indeed described as a user's manual, can be considered a found object, and as such, the actual that could become potential. So basically, so that the studios are not so terribly depressing for the students who basically collect cliches for half a semester until they feel daunted enough not to be able to design much. We have the kind of surrealist clause that those cliches, once diverted, abused, exaggerated, or clashed against other cliches, may contain the seeds for potential alternative operations in design. That studio is currently underway. So I wasn't sure whether I would finish the presentation here, or would I basically, as I said, read a project rather than show a project. I thought I should, because I indeed, I think I managed to basically present in 5 minutes, so I'll use the remaining 5 minutes in presenting basically a text which is part of the cycle of the first series of studios, which is called Under Constraint. This is one of a number of texts that I decided to publish in different magazines, but as a disguised book. So each one of the pieces has is called Under Constraint, and between brackets has its position within the book. This one is called Under Constraint Postface. Though it doesn't imply that all the other pieces of the book have been produced. It was a piece written under constraint. It was written a few years ago. And interestingly enough, I've forgotten some of the constraints I used, but I remember some of the others that I'm pleased, or let's say I will basically have the vanity of sharing with you. The first one was basically, well, I was going to write on Raymond Roussel, one of the most kind of remarkable cases of French literature in the 20th century. Michel Foucault wrote a book on him. Alain Robbe-Grillet considered Roussel the starting point for his literature. Actually, he had the most amazing line to describe Roussel. Roussel, for Robbe-Grillet, was a writer who had nothing to say. That was exactly his worth. And he added he had nothing to say, and he also said it badly. So it was basically that radical, basically displacement of literature without him being conscious of it. Aldo Rossi also, so that I basically refer at least to one architect in my talk, had a fascination for Roussel as well. He basically had the ambition of at some point writing a book called How I Designed Certain of My Projects. He indeed, Rossi mentioned that his quest of a redefinition of architecture had as an ultimate point the definition of a theory for design, which is actually what he was after when he wrote Arquitectura Análoga. Anyway, I will basically read the piece on Roussel, which is part of the series Under Constraint. Raymond Roussel died at the Grande Albergo delle Palme in Palermo the night of July 13th or the morning of July 14th, 1933. Before his departure from Paris, he had entrusted his publisher with the posthumous publication of a book which would reveal, as he thought was his duty, the method he had used to write several of his books. Comment j'écris certains de mes livres, How I Wrote Certain of My Books, appeared 2 years later and earned Roussel the recognition he hoped it would, and had so intensely pursued since his sensations of glory when writing La Doublure at the age of 19. Roussel completed his first book after 6 months, during which he was gradually filled with an euphoria of extraordinary intensity. He worked day and night, without the slightest deviation, and with no sign of fatigue. I shall reach great heights, he claimed. There lies within me an immensely powerful glory, like a shell about to explode. His enthusiasm greatly diminished during the printing of the book, and, since it eventually passed unremarked, completely extinguished after it was published. This failure plunged Roussel into a profound state of depression, which lasted several years and from which he never fully recovered. According to the doctor who later attended to him, following his crises, Roussel still maintained the unshakable conviction that glory was a fact. So throughout his life, he sought public success, hoping that it would revive those earlier feelings of exaltation. Yet to no avail, for aside for the interest of some supporters, mainly the young surrealists, who were far from the broad admiration Roussel strove for, his work attracted little attention. His books went unnoticed or were received with incomprehension. His plays, staged at his own expense to reach a larger audience, provoked scandals or were the object of derision. Roussel found some glory elsewhere. With his piano performances, with his pistol shooting profits, with his design for a luxury caravan, with his patent for a system for insulating buildings, with his formula for an improved knight and bishop checkmate, and with his impersonations, where, as he claimed, his success was enormous and complete. During the last years of his life, he attempted to recapture his earlier euphoria with the use of narcotics, which led to his death of an overdose. His will, deposited with his lawyer 6 months earlier, and seemingly his very last resort to achieve public recognition of his right to literary glory, instructed that a copy of Comment j'écris certains de mes livres be sent to a list of 22 of his supporters, and that it then be issued for sale. A series of notes to his publisher, prior to his departure to Sicily, established the definite contents of the book, and instructed that his photograph at the age of 19, the time when he felt he had l'étoile au front, the star on the forehead, appeared on its frontispiece, as well as in all reaches of his work. This last book would reveal the secret to many of the others. Sorry, one click didn't work. I'm sorry. Roussel owed his gift of invention to a method which he had discovered at about the age of 30, after the years of prospecting that followed the writing of his first book. The method entailed creating two phrases that sounded and were spelled almost identically, but had entirely different meanings, and then writing a story which would begin with one and end with the other. These pairs of homonyms, or almost homophonic phrases, would present a series of problems, or équations de fait, which it would then become necessary to solve logically. Thus the phrases, les vers de la doublure dans la pièce du fort pantalon rouge, the lines of verse of the understudy in the play of Bret Hill the Buccaneer, and les vers de la doublure dans la pièce du fort pantalon rouge, the worms in the lining of the patch of the strong red trousers, were the basis for chiquenaude, just as the phrases demoiselle, young girl, a prétendant, suitor, and demoiselle, previous beetle, a rétendant, soldier of fortuning teeth, were the basis for the complicated apparatus Roussel described from page 31 onwards in Locus Solus. I shed blood over every phrase, he once confessed. Roussel worked in complete seclusion and with great effort for a fixed number of hours each day, often to the point of exhaustion. According to the rules of his game, once he established a pair of phrases with a double meaning, or else diverted a found phrase into an homonym, he would have to solve the problem of bringing together the elements which derive from the pair, regardless of their disparity, and formulate the relationship on as realistic a level as possible, in a text written in the most neutral way possible. Sorry, I added a word. The method of word pairing, not unlike a table de dissection, would offer the chance encounter of elements whose meticulous resolution would in turn release unforeseen invention. I have traveled a great deal, he said, yet from all these travels, I never took anything for my books. Imagination accounts for everything in my work. His posthumous book would explain his method, for he felt that future writers would perhaps be able to exploit it fruitfully, yet you'd also imbue the work with a secret, let alone install the fantasy that this secret was a key to its understanding. The work bears no insight, however, no hidden treasure, no mystery to be deciphered. Raymond Roussel committed to a secret procedure that actually held no secret, a writing which did not entail reading. The method does not actually shed light on the work itself, but rather on the workings that preceded the work. Just like in his novels, where mystification is followed by revelation, Roussel meant to explain his secret after his death. He thought it was his duty to do so, but also hoped that he could gain a little posthumous recognition. Only his very last book would afford Roussel the great heights for which he had always thought he was destined. Which I guess takes me to the question of the future of studio. Yes. I'm glad I can actually separate it from the presentation. I mean, so I'll start with that one. Basically, the studios I've taught have benefited from a format of studio that was invented by Alvin Boyarsky at the A in the 70s, which basically implied, now I'm 10 years after starting, I'm not sure I can use the same thing, young critics that had a number of students, a very limited number of students, and basically taught as a lab with the idea of basically pushing the boundaries of the field. I think the question at the A at the time was how to basically digest the critical revision of the modern movement while still basically pushing architecture forward, rather than basically what was happening in many times in Europe at the time, which basically architecture was actually starting to look backwards and not keeping the same approach. So I think the invention at the A was extraordinary because it implied fragmenting the approach to the problem, and therefore each studio would have complete autonomy to push the questions of the field in different directions. Yet the important thing was that there was one core discussion that basically brought all those studios together. So let's say the model of heterogeneity of studios, of small young studios pushing different boundaries, I thought was an extraordinary device for pushing the boundaries of one problem. My question about the future, to start with, I should have actually prefaced by saying that I seldom think about the future, but I usually think about critiques of the present to try and basically think forward. So basically what I have to offer is more of a critique of the present rather than an insight into the future. My critique of the present would be that today what I think the space of challenge of studio is not studio itself, but basically our culture of studio based on heterogeneity of studios, since I think what we're actually missing today is the common denominator that the heterogeneous studios are actually pushing. In other words, what we're actually risking now is to have that heterogeneity allows for us not to have a conversation, rather than to basically attack a problem from a different angle. So basically the use of the Boyarsky model today, I think, should be negotiated against the possibility of establishing again a common denominator to see what exactly we're discussing.
If we were to have a conversation, what would be an example of the content of that conversation?
Well, I wouldn't want to post. There's a number of things I would like to talk about. But for instance, one conversation I would like to have is basically the dissolution of, this was actually tackled by Mark and Peter. Well, not my critique, but the dissolution, let's say, of an idea of what the field of architecture is. We don't discuss questions as the field today, and whether an experiment is pushing an edge of the field or not. So I think basically one of the things that I think it's important for our discussion on studio culture is to see in which way our studio culture of heterogeneity can still be negotiated with basically a core problem that we're all by and large approaching, or a number of, let's say, common conversations, so the heterogeneity leads to a conversation rather than prevents a conversation. That's basically the issue that I think is actually urgent for our studio culture today.
So does anybody want to pick up on that from here? Amale?
I think we agree. I mean, it kind of resonated with Hilary, and I think some of the questions that I have, which you do with your cliche studio. You're establishing a kind of archive and you're building, but we're all doing this sort of linearly, right, within our sort of interest, and there's a viral sort of lateral thing going, but I think we can bring it curated more. I mean, for me, the question is, well, is the question of the audience, I think, and that would be a problem that I think is common, but we are attacking in different ways, which is a really critical problem. I do think that there's incredible opportunity in this so-called expanded audience, but we haven't found it yet. And I think that if we don't find it, we're going to go back to a kind of closed kind of autonomy model, which I don't think we should. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't also ask the question of somehow what is the field of architecture rather than what is architecture. I think that would be a good way to formulate it.
Can I put you on the spot?
Well, yeah, I guess how I relate to that.
This cord doesn't stretch that far.
Here.
There you go.
I mean, much more practically, one thing that I think a lot about is if the future of the architecture studio involves interdisciplinary work and this expanded field in many ways. Expanded representation, expanded everything, expanded technology. Then what do we talk about and to who? And my version of that so far, or something that I think we all have to reckon with, is like, do we talk about different things to different people, and is that okay? And I think maybe it is. I mean, I can, so far, just kind of by chance and by the places that my research with my students and in my practice has taken me, gives me this challenge, but also this interesting, opportunity of being required to tell the same project in different ways to different people and ask different questions of different people, different, questions of different collaborators even. And I mean, I don't know exactly what that means or, what, my vision for what we should do about that challenge is, but I think it's not a bad place to be. I mean, to have to ask yourself each time, who am I talking to, and how am I going to talk about this project in a way that's not the usual script where you just go on autopilot? Could be a good thing.
So I'm going to ask the question of each. Hilary or Lise? The future?
I think
The
it's-
future?
Well, I think it's interesting when we say the field of architecture, because just by saying the field, we already accept that it's a very diverse, heterogeneous entity. But somehow there's always this desire to make architecture understood as a singular, having a singular meaning, and especially in kind of a outside of the academy. I think the multiple discussions going on simultaneously is extremely healthy. My question is should we really develop more than one definition for architecture? So there's fields of architectures. Because I really don't think that we can ever come to some kind of agreement about what that means, and maybe we should agree to disagree and legitimize certain strands and allow them to be autonomous.
I'm interested in still the idea of the discipline of architecture, and I think somehow that we need to have conversations, across each other. I think we're saying some similar things about creating audience, and everybody sort of has identified this kind of heterogeneous studio culture, which I do think is important, but I wish in a way there were things that were more common to discuss and critique. And I think one thing I find maybe a little unsettling really is just coming out of the last 10 years of building, and how do we start to talk about that in a way that can directly engage the idea of a kind of aesthetic project of architecture, and not only talk about performance. I mean, I love performance, but I think also that we can start to talk about it more in those terms. And I think representation is one way in which to media, these things are, can be in all sort of practices, it seems like.
So I wanted to just open up also to the audience, if there are, I know, I've got Cassis front and center here as an invited guest. I know.
And I sat right in the center so that I would be in trouble.
Right, so, because I also wanted to,
No politics, I have no idea.
but as somebody who's written about this, I also wanted to just invite you into the conversation as a kind of spur to anybody else out here before we all escape to.
So I can say like really naively that, and probably, getting myself in hot water, what is curious with all the kind of diversity within a certain kind of framework of what studio is here, that we have here, at the same time, studio is one of really two things that doesn't change in the schools, let's say. I mean, studio exists, first of all, and also the other thing that exists is that schools somehow provide a framework for licensing. And I find those two things very interesting, because those create a certain kind of model in school. I mean, we could ask for the future of the studio, and perhaps one of you already did, be no studio.
format. You're talking about format.
Well, not just
Yeah.
that, but the importance of it and where it is and what is studio? You know, could studio be something else? I mean, every now and then I've been in Ireland at the University of Limerick, and there when we started that school, it was one of the first new school, one of the few new schools started in the last decade in Europe, and certainly one of the first one in Ireland in a long time since then, before more opened. And the premise was maybe there shouldn't be any distinction between studio and any other courses. So there it kind of was, a very strange idea of what studio was. So I would come in and I would teach for 5 days. It was still studio, but it was now history within studio. But I wonder, when I think of, for example, say like the great striker, right, Mason Corp, to invoke some old history, none of them has had educations remotely resembling what they have. I mean, their idea of studio is extremely different. And yet, we still have this idea of studio having juries, and I pushed that sometimes. I did 2 years where I didn't have traditional juries, and I kind of did them again. And having, this idea of certain kinds of ideas that I know some other people, Gali, pushed last year, like what should the project be? Should the project be one project at the end, or should it be, many students doing many projects? And certainly Housing Studio does team teaching, but I wonder how far we're willing to push that. I think of Enrique's question of, are we willing to question the edge of the field, or willing to question the edge of architecture? And I guess for me, it seems like my own stakes, and I would kind of hope everyone's stakes in this school that the course gets so experimental, and the field that the course gets so experimental, would be to constantly question what studio might be. Because I think that, to me, it still seems remarkable how little studios are changed.
The format, yeah.
At least, let's say, in the last 50 years, as opposed to maybe on the long duration or something.
Scott? Is it inside of it? CBIB. I'm thinking of CBIB. Oh, sorry. Yeah. I don't know where I'm looking though.
In which the MacGyver, his sort of goal in effect is not to find specific solutions, or find specific styles. Actually, no, that's a separate topic. I guess what I wanted to ask Enrique and Co is that it seems to me that the question of the studio is less of a what are we teaching or how are we doing it, but more of an administrative and sort of school sort of how are they structured kind of a question. And I wanted to ask first, I actually wanted to say 3 things and ask a question. 3 things was, I think actually, more than anything, it would be interesting to see a studio in which the end product is not a series of pinups or desk creates or things, or rather where you do a studio in order to gain a process, and you do a studio in order to gain sort of an internal narrative, and you do a studio in order to sort of adopt an internal method of analysis, so that the product of the studio would not be something you could show, but could only be internalized, right? So that you do it in order, and you come out of it, and you have nothing to show to it, but all you can say is, well, I did this, and I don't know what to say. And I thought it was curious, no, really, and travel is seen as this thing where you go and travel, and you come back, and people say, how was it, and you have no idea to explain. I thought it was curious that you talked about these 3 projects, but didn't show any of the material that they had produced. And that's not because, and I thought maybe it's because you don't want to hang the project on the results of the students, but maybe the other thing is that the product is not the end goal, that it is a process. And I was curious then, if so, how do you curate the end process of your studios, and how do you seek towards that if it seems to be that the origin or the direction or the end product of your goal is the process of getting there in the first place.
You said two things that are. Is it working?
Yep.
You said two things that are crucial to let's say I'll reply on my behalf in terms of my studios. You said two things that are crucial to the studios I teach, and in that respect, basically, my studio had a question about prevalent forms of studios. One is that basically my studios were by definition anti-methodological. Methodology, basically, which is prevalent in many studios, is still something that has invented for us to basically know what we teach when we teach studio, because it's actually quite unclear what we do, and particularly if you do it in shorter periods of time rather than in kind of in Renaissance form. In other words, in a very abridged form of like time, how can you basically assign very clear tasks that could be assessed and that could basically account for something which is like the teaching of studio? So the studios I taught were based on, instead of the prescribed origin to outcome step-by-step methodology, they were based on you define a problem and then you try to basically deal with it. It was based on an old Olympian definition, rats who build a labyrinth from which they propose to escape. You define a labyrinth and then you escape. So the escape may mean that you fail, which actually happened to many of the students. But that failure was actually quite, I think, I mean, since I already taught that studio, I think I can actually even say it. That failure was almost the ambition. What you said minutes ago was exactly the ambition of my students, which is that the end product is not the thing you designed, but the findings that you formulated while designing it. So for instance, one of the things I do in my current studios is to have two final reviews. The first one, where you basically show the thing and you're still very close to it, you haven't cut the umbilical cord, and one 10 days after, where basically you're obliged not to work for 10 days, where you can simply articulate an argument. And as a matter of fact, you also, what you said, the no images on the screen is actually deliberate, and indeed, the publications of these booklets on the studios will contain no image whatsoever. The idea is that basically what matters, the end product of the studio, is an approach to a problem rather than, or let's say, the findings you may have formulated, but not the things. So I mean, the 2 points you stated, I think are kind of crucial to the studio series I've been teaching. But because it's important, I mean, one of the crucial points there is that basically one of the studio assumptions or cliches is that you work from concepts to things, or from ideas to things. And you basically first conceptualize, then you do something that by and large illustrates or is the implication of what you conceptualized. I try to work in reversal, even though I represent theory, which is also what supports that view, which is you do stuff and then you understand what you were doing. So in order to formulate an idea or a concept clearly, you may need to do a number of things, and it's a number because you correct them, and undergo a number of failures. I think some of the best projects I've had in my studio, and in the past, were basically students who actually didn't get to design the project according to the constraint they were working, but managed to deliver an extraordinary final review presentation where they narrated their failure, and in so doing, kind of redeemed their project through the illumination of a finding. So to me, basically, what matters is let's say the findings you may have encountered through design, not the thing itself.
I wonder if we would all agree on that. So there are more questions. One quick, okay, and then I'm getting also some tugs from the other side. Oh, no tugs. Okay, go, yes.
Okay, I think this is a great discussion, but I would like to see this followed up by students who graduated 2 years from now, 2 years ago, come and discuss here what they expected from the studio, what they experienced outside, and what they expected here. And I would like to bring the example from 1970s. I have a colleague graduate where professors, Kuzmanov, Dorgolov, probably you know the names, where the teachers gave us the project to do.
graduate? No. 3, more than 3, sorry. He's pretty recent. Okay, he's pretty recent. Okay. There were a couple more, yeah. Here? Well, I'll just say briefly, and I'm not one of you, but, you know, the moderator on the side, that's what I mean, that I actually didn't show any computer images. If you didn't show any images, I didn't show any images that were generated by the computer. And I did that, not to be, to use one of her term, Lisanne's term the other day, a Luddite, but to maybe suggest that maybe we place too much importance on it. And in fact, it's that I think there's been a lot of debate about it. I mean, I think that could be a whole other subject. But I didn't want the discussion to be about just the digital, because I don't think it's that interesting. I think it's a kind of thing that sits there innate, and then we actually have to engage with it somehow. And I think that the kind of cross-section through here, we're all seeing the use of it, even if it's the text that appears on the screen very prescriptively and fitting to the the square that we have up here perfectly is all incredibly digitally driven. So, I mean, I would welcome other comments, but.
I think it's interesting because I think we've in a very short time come full circle. And now it's almost like the most innovative practices are kind of having a backlash against, the digital in a way is kind of overtaking the methodology of work being done. I know that in hiring people, it's like, I'm just shocked at the lack of skill that's non-digital. I mean, I almost feel like students can't work in 2D anymore. And the ability to actually make physical things or to be able to conceive of different ways to express ideas has kind of atrophied. And so in my studio, in any case, I'm asking the students to be very conscious of this kind of knee-jerk response to move to certain tools and to be very conscious of all of the opportunities that are in front of them to express ideas and understand how the way that you express an idea affects its meaning, it affects how it's interpreted by others. It affects how you develop it and so on and so forth. This is not new. But I think that there is a backlash, and I think it's a healthy one.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that just the lottery on Wednesday showed that, I mean, Mario is going to use parametrics and David is going to use parametrics and everybody's using parametrics, but I mean, what is the intent? And I think it's amazing to me that the intent would be so different. So I think the question is more, what is our intent? For me at least.
Listening to the presentation, it might be count and speak a little bit more about audience ability, or audience. I wonder if at this reflective moment over the last 10, 15 years, if an introduction to the way in which the academy has been co-opted by professionals, if there is a risk that we run of becoming
think, I mean, for me, it's yes, there is a risk, but we have to fight this risk, and the only way to fight it is to actually be more engaged in a more precise way, and to evaluate what this last decade has done in terms of engagement. Like, where is it working? You know, and I think the exhibition Public Matters is already trying to do that. It kind of, so it's not a kind of nostalgia for an autonomous moment, but it's a, I think we've done enough now that we can sort of take the pulse. I mean, and the Studio X's are starting to do that, and so it's a conversation that we just need to cut better somehow, communicate better still.
I mean, this might be a time to segue to Reinhold's public, because I know we're at 6 o'clock. Is that okay? Do you want to come and say something about where we're going? Oh, more questions, or should we? All right, a couple more questions back here then. All right, yes, go ahead. We're tweeting, oh, I didn't know that. I'm not tweeting, so.
I think we keep trying to bring everything under one umbrella. And I don't know if other professions are like architecture in that sense. I mean, I think that we keep saying we're architects, we're all architects. There's no other way. So we all find ourselves, when we meet somebody, having to go to great lengths to explain what you do. You know, people will ask you, do you do this or do you do that? And you know, my practice has kind of moved into what most people conceive of as building buildings, but you know, you see here people doing all sorts of different things. Now maybe it's evolutionary, or maybe they're just different branches. What I resent the most is I think that there's a big difference between architecture and building. And we're so much associated with building with the little b. So that's just, you know, one thing. But I think that if you look at the profession of law or medicine, or, you know, that there's so much diversity that's acknowledged in the field, and I don't think that we acknowledge it so much here. I think it's the opposite. I'm opposite to the nostalgia. I wish we had a wider vocabulary to describe what we do.
What's the argument I made about the common? Right. No, I was trying to put emphasis on a slightly different point, which is that basically it was moments when architects look at all that architecture that exists in the world, but it's not deemed architecture, and decide to appropriate or instrumentalize it towards advancing architecture. In other words, gas stations, neons, parking lots, junk space, generic cities, sprawled cities. I mean, there's a history of these objects, or urinals, if you wanted to put it in Duchampian terms. And indeed, there's a question of authorship. The person who finds and instrumentalizes becomes the author, rather than the actual author. So it's all that authorless stuff that the field of architecture has been repelled by, and that basically defines precisely that which is outside its boundaries, is stuff that I thought within this lineage of architecture was one which was worth considering. That's the tradition of learning from Las Vegas to Deleuze, New York, looking at what there is as a potential source for think about what there could be. So rather than a celebration of the banal, it's basically a call for the scrutiny of the banal, or any basically of moving around.
actually, we pay our employees before we pay ourselves. That's why we teach, or one of the reasons why we teach. I mean, it's a very big problem, and it's an important problem, and I think the relationship is we have to somehow, whatever the means is, we have to make what we do here matter, because it's not really valued out there, and that's why you're not getting paid, because the firm is not making any money, and the fees are getting lower recession after recession after recession, and then they never go back up. So I mean, these are very practical problems that I think are a result of our standing in the world.
I mean, architecture is a creative practice, but it also is a professional and a business. And to be creative through business is incredibly important. And we are a very small office, but we have payroll, we have insurance, we pay workers' comp, all these things. Very expensive. And teaching, of course, allows us to live while the office pays for itself or tries to. But I think, your question also dovetails into this current situation where we are now in the risk of maybe not building as much as we had been, quite radically, and that it's very difficult to find jobs at all. And so what do you do? Because do you give up architecture? Or, I think when I graduated undergraduate, it was a very similar situation. And so you took any job you could get, but then also you did things like volunteer at Storefront, at Exit Art, and these things that maybe it wasn't the ideal job, but how do you keep that passion and desire for architecture going? And it's tough, for sure. So. Of I don't know. I can't answer that question because I pay people. So.
Well, I think it's a complicated thing. I mean, we also pay our interns, but getting back to the struggle right now in terms of architecture, in terms of the economic cycle, also architects are very much taken advantage of in the competition system. So there is, the opportunity for students to contribute or interns to contribute to something that's really not profitable in the office. I think that it also, points to a kind of missing link between, education and becoming a professional, that the internship is a necessary step. And it's a give and take between between the profession or between the employer and the intern.
Okay, last question. Or other questions? I don't know, it's probably something we're going to have to debate at another time. We pay our interns, we don't, but I don't know. Scott, you want to take that one? All right, Scott's got a, I'm going to,
The fact that the
ask you something though, Scott? Because, you know, with all of this diversity, isn't there a risk? I mean, I think it's great, don't get me wrong, but we haven't really built in a system for students to be able to really concentrate more in one area than another. If they're really interested in any one of these, it's a lottery whether they're going to be able to pursue that area of investigation in subsequent studios. I mean, it gets back to my thinking that there are different streams, and we should acknowledge all of them, as opposed to saying, you know, do a bit of this and do a bit of that. In the end, it's all part of the same thing. And so, I mean, that to me is an issue that we struggle with when it becomes so diverse. Yes, Yehuda?
I think that the studio is not about us if we teach there. Studio is about the students. And therefore, I think that it's not really our task to teach people to say, I go to school, I don't teach anything, I learn. I learn, hopefully, in this process, they learn. I mean, the AA was so remarkable, not just because of diversity. Diversity is certainly important. What was so extraordinary was the people who were interacting. I mean, there were not only studios, there were people like Gordon Parks. Who was Gordon Parks? Probably there are two people who don't know Gordon Parks. Gordon Parks was one of the great cybernetic experts in the world. And Andraos had the same story and the cleverness. Time. He managed to insert him. This man was dressed formally every day of the week, all the week, all the year around. And he had a very simple mandate in the school. He was, his mandate was just to pop in any discussion and to say whatever he liked, apropos anything. Because he was cybernetic, he was a mathematician, a highly professional fellow who understood almost anything. Now the problem here is that we have so much stuff that nobody understands. I mean, with due respect to my colleague and my friend David, I mean, people here load themselves and each other with so much stuff that they have no idea what it is, but they know how to maneuver. And that is the beginning of Amale, in my view. I mean, Graham, of course, introduced this idea of you can load any data and you can use the shape as a shape generator. Provided that you have enough distance from it and you don't pretend for a moment that you have any insight into any of these interdisciplinary. I mean, I don't know biology. I probably know more than people here. But it doesn't mean I know biology. It doesn't mean that I'm free to load thanks to the super digital highway. I can load anything to anything. But what does it mean? It makes us proud at best. And at worst, shudders us. That is the danger of the profession. The studio interactive best is when, as teacher, we admit our greatest knowledge is that we don't know. That's
Well, the
our
bigger
greatest knowledge.
danger-
It's difficult to admit and difficult to live up to. Yeah. So the end is that we have a menu, and every student, if he's good at it, tries to show that he's better than the others. So to get a job like this. But the point is not to get better than the others. The point is to find out something about yourself, what you in unique, some print can get out of it. And that is, and I talk in many different places today. Indeed, it wasn't just a unit master. This master of art is not unimportant, but it was not all important that it is here in our system. And I think it's time to break up a little bit in the sense that there are unit masters, there are super masters as we have, but we need more people who are free to interact, who are free molecules, who are enough educated and enough in control of themselves that they can make a good contribution anywhere they move. And these free molecules might make this heterogeneity more fruitful than just
But maybe David wants to respond. David, do you want to, because I know we're going to be here for a long time, which we could. Oh, no, you
I
want to
think
say
you're right that you don't understand my studio. But second, I think the bigger danger than being afraid to talk about something that we don't already understand, you know, is the danger of missing huge trends in our world, from public space and activism to the fact that biological technologies are going to
everybody for being here, and for your time, and for your thoughts, and for opening yourself up to this topic, and I hope it will continue. In the spirit of that, Reinhold.
Don't go away. When you're done twittering or tweeting or whatever you're doing, there is wine and assorted other refreshments just next door to celebrate the Public Matters exhibition, in which many of our colleagues here are represented with their work. The other